In the suffocating heat of March 1912, the rubber plantations along the Congo River concealed horrors that made even hardened colonial officials turn away in disgust. Deep within the Kisangani region, where the rainforest pressed against cultivated groves like a living prison, the Devries estate stood as a monument to prosperity built on human suffering. But on the morning of March 7th, the plantation's carefully maintained order shattered. Two bodies were discovered in pools of congealed blood, their throats opened so deeply that investigators would later struggle to document the savagery. The colonial authorities called it the most brutal crime in Belgian Congo's recent memory. The Congolese workers whispered a different truth. They spoke of justice delivered by hands that had endured too much, of a reckoning that had been building for years beneath the surface of forced smiles and bowed heads. This is the investigation into Amara Bokolo, the young woman who may have ended her tormentor's life before vanishing into the vast African wilderness, leaving behind questions that would haunt the colony for generations. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The administrative ledgers of the Devries plantation, preserved in the humid archives of what is now the Democratic Republic of Congo, contain an entry that reveals the calculated cruelty of colonial record-keeping. Dated October 1897, a notation in fading brown ink lists property acquisitions for the year. Among tools, buildings, and livestock appears a single line that reduces a human life to inventory. Amara, mixed heritage, approximately 14 years, household assignments. The casual brevity of those words masks a reality of deliberate exploitation that defined her entire existence from that moment forward. Laurent Devries had claimed the 2,000-hectare concession in 1895, arriving from Brussels with capital inherited from his father's diamond trading empire and ambitions that exceeded even the notorious greed of his fellow colonists. The rubber boom had transformed the Congo into a nightmare of quotas and punishments, but Devries distinguished himself through a particular combination of business acumen and personal depravity that made his plantation both profitable and feared. He had once married, briefly, to a Belgian woman named Marguerite, who died under circumstances that were never fully explained. The official record stated fever, but workers who had served in the main house during that period told different stories and whispered Lingala, stories about screaming arguments and a woman who had discovered something she should not have known. Amara entered Devries' household through circumstances that revealed the absolute power colonial masters wielded over African lives. Her mother had been a Congolese woman named Zola, who worked in the rubber processing facility, her father a Portuguese trader who had passed through the region and never returned. This mixed heritage gave Amara features that occupied an unsettling space in the colonial racial hierarchy. Her skin was several shades lighter than most Congolese workers, her hair carried a slight wave rather than tight curls, and her facial structure suggested European ancestry that made colonists uncomfortable when forced to acknowledge it. Devries recognized the utility of this ambiguity immediately. He removed her from the processing facility where her mother had recently died from infected wounds sustained during a punishment and installed her in the main house under the designation of personal attendant. What made Amara's situation particularly grotesque was that Devries never made any attempt to hide the true nature of their relationship from other Europeans. Correspondence preserved in colonial archives shows him referring to her in letters to other rubber barons with phrases that mixed ownership and intimacy in ways that would have been scandalous in Europe, but passed without comment in the Congo. "My little Amara has proven most useful in maintaining household order," he wrote to a fellow rubber baron in 1903. "She possesses a tractability combined with just enough intelligence to make her indispensable." The casual possessiveness in his language revealed how completely he had internalized the colonial logic that rendered African humanity invisible. Contemporary accounts from European visitors to the plantation describe Amara as a young woman whose striking appearance created cognitive dissonance for those encountering her. A Belgian engineer named Philippe Marchand, who spent 3 weeks at the estate in 1908 overseeing equipment installation, kept a private journal that survived in his family's papers. He wrote with obvious discomfort about dinners where Devries had Amara serve meals wearing European-styled dresses that would have been appropriate for a lower-class Belgian woman, creating the illusion that she occupied some intermediate status between servant and family member. Yet Marchand also noted seeing her arms marked with welts during a chance encounter near the kitchens, the careful sleeve coverage abandoned in the privacy of the servants' areas. The contradiction troubled him enough that he mentioned considering reporting conditions to authorities, but ultimately deciding such matters were outside his jurisdiction. Amara had access to spaces in the colonial mansion that were forbidden to other Congolese workers. She maintained a small room on the second floor, furnished with actual furniture rather than the bare floors and mats that housed other household staff. This apparent privilege served Devries' purposes in multiple ways. It allowed him private access while maintaining a veneer of propriety for visiting Europeans. It also created psychological separation between Amara and other Congolese workers, marking her as different in ways that complicated potential solidarity. But the room came with its own horror. The door locked from the outside, and former workers would later testify that they heard Amara locked inside for days at a time when Devries felt she had displeased him, with food and water withheld for infractions as minor as making insufficient eye contact or responding too slowly to commands. Against all logic and colonial prohibition, Devries had taught Amara basic literacy in French. This education was not kindness, but calculation. He wanted her capable of reading his correspondence aloud to him while he worked, of writing basic letters under his dictation, of maintaining his appointment calendar. These skills made her more valuable as an assistant and more convincing in her ambiguous social role when Europeans visited. But they also gave Amara something rare among enslaved Congolese: access to the written word, and through it, access to ideas that transcended her imprisonment.
Immediate circumstances. She read his newspapers when he discarded them, absorbing accounts of labor reforms being debated in Brussels, of international outcry over Congo atrocities, of a world beyond the plantation that operated under different rules. The Devries operation functioned with industrial efficiency wrapped around a core of systematic brutality. The plantation employed approximately 300 Congolese workers, though the term employed was a grotesque euphemism for what was effectively slavery under different legal terminology. Workers were tied to the land through debt schemes that made departure impossible, their families held hostage to their compliance, their bodies subject to punishment for failing to meet rubber collection quotas that Devries set deliberately beyond realistic achievement. The punishment regime was both public and meticulous. Devries maintained a leather-bound ledger documenting infractions and corresponding penalties. 20 lashes for quota shortfall, 3 days without food.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Food for insolence, severing of hand for theft. The clinical precision of the record-keeping transformed atrocity into administration. Amara occupied a strange position within this system of terror. She experienced privileges that other workers could only imagine: sleeping under a roof, eating food from Devries' table, wearing manufactured clothing instead of rough-woven fabrics. Yet she also endured punishments specifically calibrated to her unique vulnerability. When Devries determined she had failed to maintain proper deference, he would confine her to a specially constructed space beneath the main house foundation, a stone cell originally built as cold storage but repurposed as a psychological torture chamber. The cell measured perhaps 6 feet in each direction, with no light source and humidity that made breathing feel like drowning. Former workers reported that Amara's screams from underground confinement echoed through the compound during certain nights, sounds that everyone learned to ignore because acknowledging them meant acknowledging complicity. Father Johannes Vermeer operated a Catholic mission at Yengambi, approximately 15 kilometers upriver from the Devries plantation. Unlike many missionaries whose primary function was legitimizing colonial occupation, Vermeer harbored genuine doubts about the moral foundations of the entire enterprise. His personal journals, discovered decades later in a Dutch monastery archive, reveal a man struggling with profound contradictions. He served an institution that blessed colonial conquest while witnessing daily the human cost of that conquest. Vermeer made periodic visits to the plantation, ostensibly to provide spiritual guidance, but actually to bear witness to conditions he felt powerless to change. His entries about Amara begin in 1906, when she would have been approximately 23 years old. "She asked questions today that I found deeply unsettling," Vermeer wrote in September 1906, "questions about whether God truly created hierarchies of human worth, whether the Bible's acceptance of bondage in ancient times meant that our current arrangements were divinely ordained, whether forgiveness extended to those who killed in pursuit of their own liberation. I gave her the answers my training demands, but they felt hollow even as I spoke them. This young woman has been taught just enough to question everything, but not enough to find answers that might bring peace. I fear what such knowledge without power might drive a person toward." The mission church saw Amara perhaps 3 or 4 times yearly, always accompanied by Devries or a trusted overseer, always dressed in her ambiguous European-style clothing, always watched. But, during those brief visits, she managed whispered conversations with other Congolese Christians, exchanging information in Lingala while pretending to pray. Through these careful exchanges, she learned about networks of workers who had escaped to remote villages, about missionaries in other regions who actively helped people flee, about changes in colonial law that were supposed to limit the worst excesses of forced labor but remained largely unenforced. Each fragment of information was a small flame of possibility in the darkness of her captivity. In January 1911, something shifted in the plantation's terrible equilibrium. Devries received correspondence from Brussels announcing his sister's impending visit. Claudette Devries had married into Belgian nobility and cultivated an image as a progressive voice on colonial reform, writing newspaper articles about the need for more humane treatment of Congolese workers while carefully avoiding any critique of the fundamental colonial project. Her visit was meant to produce a favorable report she could cite in her reform advocacy, burnishing her credentials while providing her brother with useful political cover. Devries recognized that Claudette's presence demanded adjustments to plantation operations. The most visible brutalities would need to be temporarily suspended. The appearance of a well-run, almost benevolent estate would need to be constructed and maintained. For Amara, Claudette's planned visit represented both danger and possibility. Devries made clear his expectations. She would present herself as evidence of his enlightened approach to racial matters, a Congolese woman elevated through his generosity to a position of relative comfort and education. Any deviation from this performance would result in consequences that Devries described in detail, graphic enough that workers who overheard him speak to her that day remembered his words decades later. But the visit also meant Devries would be distracted, his attention divided between managing Claudette's observations and maintaining the plantation's productivity. Gaps might appear in the surveillance that normally enclosed Amara completely. Claudette Devries arrived in March 1911, traveling upriver by steamboat with an entourage that included her lady's maid, a journalist documenting her reform tour, and enough luggage to stock a small warehouse. Her 2-week stay unfolded exactly as Laurent had orchestrated. She toured carefully selected areas of the plantation, interviewed workers who had been coached on acceptable responses, and observed Amara with the kind of anthropological fascination that reduced human beings to specimens. In her subsequent newspaper article, Claudette described Amara as a touching example of how proper European influence could elevate even mixed-race individuals toward civilization, completely blind to or deliberately ignoring the prison her brother had constructed around this young woman's life. But, during those 2 weeks, Amara observed details that would later prove crucial. She noticed how Devries modified his behavior under Claudette's gaze, how certain observations triggered Vermeer's unguarded expressions of dismay, and how Claudette, at any rate, did not inhibit the plantation's star actor in public punishments of hand amputation. She almost seemed to enjoy it. Amara engaged in two hushed conversations with Vermeer during Claudette's visit, one in the propulsor shed after Claudette had complimented the men's surprisingly demonstrative efficacy, and one near the cooking fires after Claudette had complimented the women's surprising strength in carrying wood, giving her risked information about a distant missionary who might be able to provide sanctuary while serving as the victim in his multiple interpretations of slavery. Claudette Devries left as suddenly as she had arrived, leaving Amara to ponder the possibilities created by her brief presence and the new window into Devries' psychology that she now had at her very disposal.
Rooms were suddenly forbidden to her sister, how conversations were carefully controlled. She saw the performance of benevolence and recognized it as performance, understanding for, perhaps the first time, how much power depended on perception rather than reality. She also noticed something else. In his distraction, Devries had become careless with his keys. The ring that included access to his private office, to the punishment cells, to the locked cabinets containing administrative documents, that ring spent more time sitting on tables or hanging from hooks than secured on his person. 3 days after Claudette's departure, Amara made a decision that would alter the trajectory of her entire life. The carefully maintained facade of the plantation had returned to its brutal normal operations, but something had changed within her during those 2 weeks of performance. She had seen how fragile Devries' power actually was, how dependent it remained on circumstances he could not fully control. More importantly, she had managed to create an impression of a wax key during one of Devries' careless moments, pressing his office key into a piece of softened candle wax she had concealed in her clothing. The impression was crude and incomplete, but it represented possibility. Amara had no elaborate escape plan, no detailed map of safe routes through the rainforest, no confirmed contacts waiting to spirit her toward freedom. What she possessed was desperation, refined by years of abuse into something harder and more focused than mere hope. She had also accumulated small resources over the years, coins that Devries and his occasional European visitors dropped or forgot, retrieved by her careful fingers during cleaning. Belgian francs, Portuguese escudos, even some older Leopold-era currency that might still hold value. She had hidden this modest fortune in a crack behind the wooden paneling in her room, wrapped in oilcloth to protect it from the perpetual humidity. It amounted to perhaps 30 francs total, not enough to transform her circumstances, but enough to purchase food or bribe a riverboat captain for passage. The opportunity presented itself on April 3, 1911, when Devries announced his intention to travel downriver to Basoko for a meeting with other plantation owners. These gatherings happened quarterly, occasions for the colonial elite to coordinate pricing strategies, share information about labor management techniques, and drink imported cognac while congratulating themselves on bringing civilization to the Congo. Devries typically remained in Basoko for 4 to 5 days, leaving the plantation under the supervision of Christophe Baudin, his head overseer. Baudin was a former force publique sergeant who had been discharged for excessive brutality, even by the military's generous standards, a distinction that suggested truly remarkable cruelty. But Baudin lacked Devries' obsessive attention to detail, particularly regarding Amara's movements within the main house. On the morning of April 5th, 2 days after Devries' departure, Amara walked out of the plantation compound during the pre-dawn hours when most workers were still sleeping and Baudin was recovering from the previous night's drinking. She wore the plainest dress she owned, had wrapped her head in cloth that concealed her distinctive hair, and carried nothing except the small bundle of money and a kitchen knife she had taken from the servants' area. Her plan, such as it existed, was to reach the river and find passage on one of the supply boats that moved constantly between settlements. Beyond that, she trusted to luck and the possibility that somewhere in the vast expanse of the Congo, she might find people willing to help rather than return her for whatever reward Devries would certainly offer. The immediate terrain surrounding the plantation was cleared for rubber cultivation, but beyond the worked groves, the rainforest reasserted itself with suffocating density. Amara had lived her entire conscious life within the plantation boundaries and possessed virtually no experience navigating wilderness. The forest at dawn was a chaos of sound and shadow, bird calls mixing with insect drones and the rustling of unseen creatures in the undergrowth. She followed the rough direction of the river, guided by the slope of the land and occasional glimpses of water through the vegetation, moving as quickly as the tangled growth permitted. What she could not have anticipated was encountering Patrice Lumasi on the river road, approximately 8 kilometers from the plantation, just as the sun was fully clearing the horizon. Lumasi was a free Congolese man, a status that existed in complicated legal and social space within the colonial system. His father had been a merchant who secured his family's freedom through a combination of successful trading and strategic relationships with early colonial administrators, creating a legal status that subsequent officials grudgingly honored. Lumasi continued the family business, transporting goods between settlements along the Congo River, occupying a precarious middle ground between the colonized majority and the European elite. Lumasi was traveling alone that morning, guiding a cart pulled by 2 oxen and loaded with trade goods headed toward Yanambi. He spotted Amara walking barefoot along the muddy road, clearly exhausted despite the early hour, obviously running from something or someone. In that moment, Lumasi faced a choice that defined his character. Helping a fugitive meant risking everything he and his family had built over 2 generations. Colonial law was explicit about penalties for those who aided escaped workers. Yet Lumasi had lost his younger sister Adele 15 years ago when she had been seized under the forced labor system and worked to death on a rubber plantation in Ecuador province. Her death had created a wound that never properly healed, a rage against the entire colonial apparatus that he normally kept carefully hidden beneath the deferential demeanor necessary for survival. Lumasi stopped his cart and studied Amara for perhaps 30 seconds before making his decision. He recognized something in her expression, the same desperate determination he imagined Adele must have worn before her death. Without speaking, he gestured toward the cart, then carefully arranged grain sacks to create a hidden space where someone could lie concealed. Amara understood immediately, climbing into the cart and allowing Lumasi to cover her completely with the rough burlap sacks. The hiding place was stifling and uncomfortable, but it was also salvation. As Lumasi resumed his journey, Amara lay in darkness, feeling the cart's movements, and understanding that her life now depended entirely on this stranger's continued willingness to risk himself on her behalf.
That were barely maintained and subject to flooding during rain season. Lumasi knew the route intimately, knew which colonial checkpoints were reliably staffed and which were often abandoned, knew which river settlements had populations sympathetic to fugitives and which were filled with informants eager to collect bounties. He made the trip perhaps 6 times yearly under normal circumstances, but nothing about this journey would be normal. They traveled for most of the first day without speaking, Lumasi occasionally passing back dried fish and water through the grain sacks, Amara remaining as still and silent as possible despite cramping muscles and difficulty breathing in the confined space. As evening approached, Lumasi pulled off the main road toward a small clearing he knew, a place where traveling merchants often made camp because it offered water access and enough open space to keep watch for animals or bandits. Only after they were well off the road and Lumasi had confirmed no other travelers were in the vicinity did he help Amara out of her hiding place. She emerged stiff and disoriented, blinking in the fading light, her dress soaked with sweat despite the relative coolness of dusk. Lumasi built a small fire, more for light than warmth in the tropical climate, and prepared a basic meal of cassava and dried meat while Amara gradually recovered her ability to move properly. They ate in silence initially, both recognizing that conversation required establishing trust neither yet fully felt. Finally, as full darkness settled over the forest, Lumasi spoke in Lingala, asking the question that had been implicit since the morning. "Who are you running from?" Amara's response came slowly, in French initially, before Lumasi gently suggested Lingala would be safer. She told him an edited version of her story, describing Devries' plantation but not initially revealing the full nature of her relationship with the owner. She spoke about the forced labor, the punishments, the impossible quotas, framing her escape as just another worker fleeing intolerable conditions. But Lumasi had decades of experience reading people,
a skill essential for surviving as a trader in colonial territory. He noticed details that contradicted her narrative. Her hands lacked the calluses and scars typical of plantation workers. Her French was too fluent, her bearing too different from women who spent their lives in the processing facilities. "You were in the main house," Lumasi said finally, not quite a question. Amara's silence confirmed it. Lumasi did not press for details, recognizing that whatever had occurred in that house was likely too painful for immediate telling. Instead, he shared his own story, speaking about Adele for perhaps the first time in years, describing how his sister had been taken at age 16 and returned in a wooden box 6 months later, her body bearing evidence of treatment that made Lumasi weep even in the retelling. That loss had taught him something fundamental about the colonial system. It consumed people with casual indifference, transformed human beings into units of production, then discarded them when they broke under the strain. During their 3 nights of travel toward Bosoko, Lumasi taught Amara practical survival skills she had never needed within the plantation's confines. He showed her how to identify which forest plants were edible and which would cause sickness or death. He taught her basic navigation using the river and stars, methods for moving quietly through undergrowth, ways to obscure footprints when necessary. More importantly, he taught her phrases in several regional languages beyond Lingala, enough vocabulary to conduct basic transactions or ask for help. This linguistic flexibility might mean the difference between successful flight and capture if she needed to continue beyond where Lumasi could safely accompany her. They stopped at 2 locations during the journey, both carefully chosen by Lumasi for their relative safety. The first was the compound of a Belgian trader named Isabelle Moreau, who operated a small trading post about 40 kilometers from the Devries plantation. Moreau was an anomaly in colonial society, a woman who had come to the Congo following her husband's death in Brussels, seeking to escape grief through immersion in a completely different world. She maintained correct relationships with colonial authorities, but harbored private sympathies that occasionally manifested in practical ways. Lumasi had sold her goods on multiple occasions and recognized in her a potential ally. Moreau's trading post consisted of a main building that served as both store and residence, surrounded by storage sheds and a small dock for riverboats. She received Lumasi and his concealed passenger after dark, listening to his brief explanation with an expression that revealed nothing. Her response was characteristically pragmatic. She could provide food, a safe place to sleep for 1 night, and information about river traffic that might be useful for continued flight. What she could not provide was extended sanctuary. Colonial authorities made periodic inspections of her operation, and concealing a fugitive during such an inspection would mean losing everything she had built. She spoke directly to Amara, acknowledging her as a person rather than a problem to be managed, a simple courtesy that nevertheless struck Amara with unexpected force. Moreau also provided something less tangible but equally valuable. During their brief conversation that evening, she spoke about networks of people throughout the Congo who quietly resisted the most extreme colonial brutalities. Not organized resistance in any formal sense, but individual acts of subtle defiance. Missionaries who reported abuses to European newspapers. Traders who occasionally looked the other way when fugitives needed passage. Colonial officials whose enforcement of brutal policies was deliberately inefficient. She described this as a kind of shadow society operating within the official colonial structure. People who maintained public compliance while privately working to mitigate the system's worst excesses. The knowledge that such networks existed, however informally, gave Amara something she desperately needed, evidence that her escape was not entirely solitary, that others might choose to help if circumstances aligned properly. The second stop was more dangerous. Approximately 20 kilometers from Bosoko, Lumasi detoured to the Catholic mission at Yengambi, specifically to the residence of Father Johannes Vermeer.
Lumasi had known Vermeer for years through trading relationships, had observed the missionaries' growing disillusionment with colonial practices, had heard stories about Vermeer's willingness to help certain individuals in desperate circumstances. But approaching Vermeer meant revealing Amara's flight to someone with connections to colonial authorities, a calculated risk that Lumasi took only after extensive internal debate. They arrived at the mission compound in the late afternoon, when Vermeer was typically alone in his small office reviewing correspondence or preparing sermons. Lumasi requested a private conversation, then brought Amara into the office and simply let her presence speak for itself. Vermeer recognized her immediately from his visits to the Devries plantation, his expression shifting from confusion to understanding to something resembling horror as he grasped what her appearance at his mission implied. Vermeer's response revealed the depth of his moral struggle. He had taken vows of obedience that theoretically required reporting fugitives to proper authorities. He served an institution deeply embedded in the colonial project, dependent on colonial goodwill for its continued operation. Yet he had also taken vows to serve the poor and oppressed, to provide sanctuary to those in desperate need, to embody Christian principles that seemed fundamentally incompatible with colonial realities. For several minutes, Vermeer simply stood in his office, visibly wrestling with contradictions that had been building throughout his years in the Congo. His decision, when it came, was framed in theological language but rooted in profound rage against systems he had spent too long accommodating. "If God created all people in the divine image," Vermeer said quietly, "then any system that reduces people to property is blasphemy, regardless of its legal status. I cannot, in conscience, return you to blasphemy." It was perhaps the most radical statement of his life, an acknowledgement that his loyalty to human dignity exceeded his loyalty to colonial order. Vermeer could not offer Amara extended sanctuary at the mission. His activities were too visible, his movements too constrained by ecclesiastical oversight. But he could provide immediate resources and crucial information. He gave her a small amount of money from his personal funds, not enough to transform her circumstances, but enough to supplement what she had saved. More importantly, he provided names and locations. A Belgian doctor in Stanleyville who had been quietly treating injured fugitives, a riverboat captain who sometimes accepted passengers without asking excessive questions, a remote village, approximately 50 kilometers inland, where the colonial presence was minimal and strangers could potentially disappear into local populations. During the few hours Amara spent at Vermeer's mission, something unexpected occurred between them. The missionary, whose wife and daughter had died in a fire 3 years earlier, under circumstances he had never fully investigated but privately suspected involved arson by colonists, angered by his increasingly critical sermons, found himself drawn to this young woman in ways that transcended simple pastoral concern. He recognized in her the same fierce intelligence that had characterized his late daughter, the same refusal to accept easy answers or comfortable lies. For Amara's part, she experienced for the first time in her conscious memory what it meant to be treated with genuine respect by a European, to have her thoughts solicited and valued, to be addressed as a person possessed of inherent dignity rather than as property requiring management. Their conversation that evening ranged across topics that would have been impossible within the plantation's confines. Vermeer asked her about her experience of Devries' household, not prurient questions, but genuine attempt to understand the psychological mechanisms of oppression. Amara spoke more openly than she had with Lumasi, describing not just physical brutalities, but the more subtle violences of forced performance, of being required to embody whatever role Devries' circumstances demanded, of having her very identity treated as something malleable and subordinate to her owner's needs. She described the particular torment of being educated just enough to understand her situation's injustice, but not enough to identify clear paths toward freedom. Vermeer, in turn, shared his own growing crisis of faith, not in God, but in the institutions that claim to represent divine will.
He spoke about the profound disconnect between missionary rhetoric about saving souls and the reality of blessing a system that destroyed bodies. He described the careful moral calculations that had allowed him to continue his work, the compromises he had made in pursuit of incremental improvements, the way he had learned to look past the worst abuses in order to maintain his position and theoretical influence. Speaking with Amara, he confronted the possibility that all his careful compromises had been fundamentally cowardice, that gradualism in the face of atrocity was itself a form of participation in that atrocity. As darkness fell completely, and Lumasi indicated they needed to continue their journey if they hoped to reach Basoko before Devries discovered Amara's absence and began organizing pursuit, Vermeer made a promise that would reshape his remaining life. "If you are recaptured," he told Amara, "I will do everything in my power to ensure you receive legal representation. I will document what I know of Devries' treatment of you. I will testify if given opportunity. I cannot guarantee justice within a system designed to deny it, but I can guarantee you will not face that system alone." The final stretch of journey to Basoko was the most dangerous. The town functioned as a regional administrative center, with a permanent force publique garrison and colonial officials who maintained closer oversight of river traffic. Lumasi knew that entering Basoko with a concealed passenger meant risking inspection at any of several checkpoints. His plan, discussed with Amara during their last night of travel, was to bring her as close to the town as he safely could, then direct her toward a specific riverboat captain named Edward Koenig, a German trader who was known for asking few questions of passengers willing to pay in cash. They reached the outskirts of Basoko on April 8th, approximately 72 hours after leaving the Devries plantation. Lumasi could go no further without exposing himself to dangerous scrutiny. He helped Amara from her hiding place in the pre-dawn darkness, provided her with detailed directions to the river dock where Koenig typically moored his vessel, and gave her most of his own traveling money, an act of generosity that stunned Amara into temporary speechlessness. When she tried to express gratitude, Lumasi simply shook his head. "My sister never had anyone to help her. Perhaps helping you balances some small portion of that cosmic injustice." Amara entered Basoko alone, wearing her plainest dress and a head wrap that concealed her distinctive features, moving through the waking town toward the river docks. The settlement was larger than anything she had experienced, with perhaps 3,000 residents, including both Congolese and Europeans, buildings of varying construction from traditional structures to two-story brick buildings.
Imported European architecture, a constant flow of people and goods that created opportunities for anonymity, but also multiplied chances of dangerous encounters. She located Koenig's riverboat, a battered, steam-powered vessel named the Louisa, moored at the southern end of the commercial dock area. Koenig was a weathered man in his 50s, his face deeply lined from decades under the equatorial sun, his manner suggesting someone who had long since ceased being surprised by anything the Congo presented. When Amara approached him with careful deference and inquired about passage upriver towards Stanleyville, he studied her with eyes that had clearly evaluated countless desperate people before her. His price was 15 francs for deck passage, no questions asked about her background or reasons for travel. It was nearly half of her total money, but it represented escape from the immediate danger zone around the Devries plantation. The Louisa was scheduled to depart the following morning, April 9th, which meant Amara needed to find safe shelter for approximately 18 hours in a town where any European might recognize her mixed heritage as unusual, and any Congolese might identify her as a fugitive. Koenig, reading her situation with practiced accuracy, made a suggestion. His vessel had a small storage area below deck where passengers sometimes slept if weather made deck passage uncomfortable. For an additional 5 francs, she could stay there immediately, emerging only when the boat was well underway and any pursuit from Basoko would be impractical. Amara agreed without hesitation, handing over 20 francs total and understanding that she was trusting this stranger with both her money and her life.
Koenig showed her to the storage area, a cramped space that smelled of machine oil and old cargo, barely large enough to lie down, but offering complete concealment. She spent the next 24 hours in that darkness, listening to the sounds of the town and dock through the hull, existing in a state of suspended tension between achieved escape and fear of imminent recapture. The Louisa finally departed Bosoko at mid-morning on April 9th, its steam engine producing rhythmic chugging sounds that gradually carried the vessel upriver towards Stanleyville, approximately 150 kilometers distant. Only after several hours of travel did Amara emerge from the storage area, moving carefully onto the deck and seeing for the first time the full expanse of the Congo River. Wider than anything she had imagined, its brown waters moving with massive power toward the Atlantic Ocean thousands of kilometers to the west. Stanleyville emerged from the river mist like a mirage of European civilization imposed upon African landscape, its colonial architecture creating jarring contrasts with the dense vegetation that pressed against the settlement's boundaries. The town functioned as a major administrative and commercial hub for the entire Oriental province, its population approaching 15,000 residents, including several hundred Europeans who maintained the elaborate social hierarchies that defined colonial life. Church spires rose above warehouses and administrative buildings, steamboat docks lined the riverfront in organized rows, and paved streets in the European quarter suggested permanence that the tropical climate constantly challenged. The Louisa arrived at Stanleyville's main commercial dock on the afternoon of April 11, 1911, its engine's final chugging breaths announcing the journey's completion. Amara had spent most of the voyage concealed in various shadowed areas of the vessel, emerging only during nighttime hours when other passengers were less likely to observe her closely. Koenig had proven true to his word about asking no questions, but he had also made clear that Stanleyville represented the limit of his protection. Once she disembarked, she would navigate the town's dangers alone. Amara stepped onto the dock carrying nothing except the knife she had taken from the plantation kitchen and approximately 8 francs remaining from her savings. Her dress was wrinkled and stained from days of travel, her appearance announcing her as someone without resources or status. The immediate challenge was finding shelter before nightfall while avoiding the attention of colonial authorities or the network of informants who earned supplemental income by reporting suspicious individuals. Father Vermeer had mentioned Dr. Francois Beaumont, a Belgian physician who maintained a small clinic in Stanleyville's mixed neighborhood, the area where European commercial interests met Congolese residential districts. Beaumont had earned Vermeer's trust through actions rather than words. The doctor's willingness to treat injured fugitives without reporting them to authorities, establishing him as someone whose humanitarian commitments occasionally superseded colonial loyalty. Locating Beaumont's clinic required Amara to navigate Stanleyville's unfamiliar geography while avoiding the European quarter, where her presence would immediately attract scrutiny. The clinic occupied the ground floor of a 2-story structure that showed signs of age and inadequate maintenance, a small wooden sign in French and Lingala announcing medical services available to all patients. Amara approached the clinic as dusk settled over the town, entering through a doorway that opened into a waiting area containing perhaps a dozen Congolese patients. A young Congolese assistant looked up from documenting patient information, his expression shifting from routine indifference to heightened attention as he assessed Amara's appearance. She requested an appointment with Dr. Beaumont, speaking in French and using the specific phrase Vermeer had taught her, mentioning that Father Johannes had suggested the doctor's services might be particularly appropriate for her circumstances. The assistant's demeanor changed immediately upon hearing Vermeer's name, his careful neutrality replaced with something resembling comprehension mixed with caution. Beaumont proved to be a man in his early 40s, his face carrying the weathered appearance common among Europeans who had spent extended periods in tropical climates, his manner suggesting someone who had witnessed considerable human suffering and developed practical rather than sentimental responses to it. Beaumont's initial questions were direct and medically focused, establishing that Amara required not immediate treatment for injury or illness, but rather assistance of a different nature. Only after confirming this and carefully closing the consultation room door did he acknowledge understanding the real purpose of her visit. He could provide shelter for a maximum of 1 week in a small storage room adjacent to the clinic that was occasionally used for patients requiring overnight observation. During that time, she could make new contacts and attempt to arrange onward passage.
Would need to remain essentially invisible, emerging from the room only during nighttime hours when the clinic was closed. The storage room that became Amara's sanctuary measured approximately 3 meters by 4 meters, its space dominated by medical supplies and a narrow cot that Beaumont's assistant quickly assembled. A single small window provided ventilation, but looked onto an interior courtyard rather than the street, minimizing the possibility of observation from outside the clinic. Amara would spend the next week in this confined space, existing in a state of suspended tension between gratitude for temporary safety and anxiety about an uncertain future. Beaumont visited the storage room briefly each evening after closing the clinic. On the third evening, he brought news that sent cold fear through Amara's body, despite the tropical heat. Colonial authorities had circulated descriptions of a fugitive from a plantation near Kisangani, a mixed heritage woman in her late 20s, wanted for absconding from assigned labor. The description was general enough that it could apply to numerous women, but Beaumont's careful presentation of the information made clear his concern that Amara specifically was the subject of this search. The notices had been posted at all major river docks, distributed to force public garrisons throughout the region, and shared with colonial administrators. A reward of 50 francs had been offered for information leading to the fugitive's capture, a substantial sum that would motivate considerable effort. Through his network of contacts, Beaumont learned additional details that compounded the danger. Devries had personally traveled to Stanleyville, taking residence at the European Club while coordinating search efforts with force publique commanders. His presence in the town meant that any capture would result in immediate return to the plantation. The revelation transformed Amara's situation from dangerous to potentially catastrophic. The town suddenly felt impossibly small, its streets becoming potential sites of fatal encounter. During her 4th night in the storage room, Amara experienced a nightmare that would recur throughout her remaining life. She dreamed of being back in the plantation main house, climbing the stairs toward Devries' bedroom while carrying a knife. In the dream, she reached his room and found him sleeping, vulnerable and unaware. But when she moved to strike, her body became paralyzed, the knife frozen in her hand while Devries slowly opened his eyes and smiled at her with terrible knowledge. The nightmare revealed something Amara had not consciously acknowledged. Her escape represented not merely flight from intolerable circumstances, but unfinished business that would haunt her until resolved. She had run from Devries, but running meant he continued to exist as the defining force in her life, the person whose decisions shaped her possibilities even in his absence. The dream suggested an alternative she had not allowed herself to consciously consider. What if, instead of running indefinitely, always looking over her shoulder for pursuit, she confronted the source of her oppression, directly and permanently? Beaumont returned on the 5th evening with information that made Amara's time in Stanleyville untenable. Force public soldiers had begun conducting systematic searches of residential areas in the mixed neighborhood, officially seeking illegal weapons, but actually looking for anything irregular, including concealed individuals. The searches were moving methodically through the district, and Beaumont's clinic would likely be inspected within the next 2 or 3 days. That same evening, Beaumont brought a visitor, introducing him as Kwame Osei, a legal clerk who worked in the colonial courts. Osei was originally from Gold Coast Colony, had received education in British territory before circumstances brought him to Belgian Congo, and occupied an ambiguous position as a literate African, performing functions that gave him access to colonial legal machinery while remaining fundamentally excluded from actual power. Osei's assessment was brutally honest. Colonial law provided virtually no protection for Africans accused of violating labor contracts. The legal proceedings were mere formalities preceding inevitable return to plantation owners. The conversation with Osei crystallized something for Amara. The legal system was the same system that had created and maintained the conditions of her enslavement. Seeking justice within that system meant accepting its fundamental legitimacy. But what if the system itself lacked legitimacy? What if the proper response to systematic injustice was not appeal to corrupted legal structures, but direct action that denied those structures any authority over her existence? On her sixth morning in Beaumont's storage room, Amara made a decision that would alter the trajectory of multiple lives. She would not continue fleeing upriver, always staying one step ahead of pursuit, living in constant fear of capture. Instead, she would return to the source of her oppression and eliminate it permanently. Devries would never stop pursuing her as long as he lived. His obsession would drive him to continue the search indefinitely. The only path to genuine freedom required removing Devries permanently from her life. When Beaumont arrived that evening, Amara presented her decision with a calmness that surprised even herself. The doctor's response was complicated, mixing concern for her safety with recognition that she had identified a grim truth. Beaumont did not endorse her plan, could not ethically support premeditated violence regardless of provocation, but neither did he try to dissuade her through moral arguments he knew would ring hollow in her circumstances. Instead, he asked practical questions about how she intended to proceed, what resources she would need. Over the following 2 days, Beaumont and Osei carefully introduced Amara to several individuals that comprised an informal network of resistance in Stanleyville. Among these contacts was a man who identified himself only as Diodon, claiming no family name and offering no details about his background, beyond that he had worked in forced labor conditions for 7 years before escaping. Diodon possessed skills that suggested military training, spoke multiple languages, and carried himself with a confidence that hinted at experiences far beyond agricultural work. When Amara explained her intention to return to the Devries plantation, not as a fugitive, but as someone delivering justice, Diodon's response was immediate. He would help, not because he knew her personally, but because her target represented the entire system that had destroyed countless lives. The second recruit was more surprising. A Belgian man, perhaps 30 years old, gaunt and hollow-eyed, who appeared at Beaumont's clinic late one evening.
Man introduced himself simply as André, refusing to provide additional identification, and explained that he had deserted from force publique service 6 months earlier after participating in a punitive expedition that had destroyed an entire village for failing to meet rubber quotas. The expedition had included killing approximately 40 people, burning homes, destroying food stores, actions that André described with visible revulsion as atrocities that had shattered something fundamental in his understanding of himself. He wanted to help, needed to help, as some form of inadequate penance for his participation in systematic brutality. With Dieudonné and André committed, Amara possessed the nucleus of a group capable of attempting what she proposed. Dieudonné volunteered for reconnaissance, proposing to travel downriver under the pretext of seeking agricultural work, observe the plantation for several days, and return with detailed intelligence that could inform tactical planning. As plans coalesced during Amara's final days in Beaumont's storage room, the doctor wrestled with his own conscience about the extent of his involvement. He was providing material support for what would certainly constitute murder under colonial law, regardless of how morally justified the action might be. Yet he also recognized the profound hypocrisy of invoking such principles in a context where the legal system itself sanctioned violence on massive scale. In the end, Beaumont's decision rested not on abstract principles, but on simple human recognition. Amara deserved freedom, Devries deserved judgment, and the colonial system that protected one while denying the other forfeited any claim to legitimate authority over the situation. Dieudonné departed Stanleyville on April 18th, traveling downriver on a commercial barge that transported manufactured goods and European supplies to plantation settlements throughout the region. He carried forged papers identifying him as a free laborer seeking employment, documents that Osei had produced using his access to colonial administrative materials and his knowledge of official stamps and signatures. The forgery was adequate rather than perfect,
sufficient to withstand casual inspection, but potentially problematic if subjected to detailed scrutiny by suspicious authorities. Dieudonné accepted this risk with the calm demeanor of someone who had long since made peace with the possibility of violent death. The journey downriver retraced the route Amara had followed during her escape, though Dieudonné's circumstances differed dramatically from her desperate flight. He traveled openly, engaged other passengers in casual conversation, presented himself as unremarkable in every way that might attract attention or create memorable impressions. His military training, whatever its origins, had apparently included instruction in surveillance and infiltration techniques that served him well during the 3-day journey toward the Devries plantation. Dieudonné disembarked at a river landing approximately 5 kilometers from the plantation, claiming to fellow passengers that he intended to seek work at several properties in the area before determining which offered the best conditions. He made his way overland through a combination of rubber groves and remaining forest, approaching the plantation from the eastern boundary, where workers' housing bordered cultivated areas. His strategy was simple: present himself as a laborer seeking employment, observe conditions and routines during whatever initial processing prospective workers underwent, then disappear before any formal assignment could trap him within the plantation's labor system. The Devries operation had changed in subtle ways during the weeks since Amara's escape. Security had tightened noticeably, with additional overseers patrolling boundaries and monitoring worker movements with increased vigilance. Dieudonné noted these changes during his first afternoon, recognizing that Devries' obsession with recovering his fugitive property had manifested in enhanced control measures affecting all plantation operations. The main house showed signs of recent activity, with European visitors arriving and departing at irregular intervals, suggesting Devries was conducting business while simultaneously coordinating his search efforts. Dieudonné managed to observe Victor Renard, the colonial enforcer who served as Devries' primary instrument of terror. Renard was conducting an inspection of the punishment facilities when Dieudonné caught sight of him, a powerfully built man whose physical presence alone seemed calculated to intimidate. Workers gave Renard considerable space as he moved through the compound, their body language revealing the fear his presence generated. Dieudonné recognized that any successful action against Devries would need to account for Renard's protective function and his capacity for violence. The reconnaissance extended over 4 days, with Dieudonné sleeping in workers' quarters and participating in enough labor activities to maintain his cover while systematically documenting the plantation's vulnerabilities. He noted that Devries maintained a predictable evening routine, dining alone in the main house around 7 each evening before retiring to his study for several hours of paperwork and drinking. Renard typically departed the main house by 9 in the evening, returning to his own quarters in a separate structure, approximately 100 meters from the mansion. This created a window between 9 and midnight when Devries was alone in the main house, protected only by the general presence of workers who had learned through brutal experience not to interfere in matters involving their owner. The main house itself presented both obstacles and opportunities. The structure was built in typical colonial style, with the ground floor containing public rooms and service areas, while the upper floor housed private chambers, including Devries' bedroom and study. Access points included the main entrance, which was typically locked after Devries' departure, and several side doors used by household staff that might be easily breached. Windows on the ground floor were barred according to standard security practices, but upper floor windows remained unprotected, presenting potential entry routes for anyone capable of reaching them. Dieudonné paid particular attention to Renard's quarters and routines. The enforcer maintained irregular patrol schedules, sometimes conducting nighttime inspections of the plantation boundaries, but often remaining in his quarters after his official duties concluded. Determining Renard's location on any given night would require either direct observation or accepting the risk that he might appear unexpectedly during any action against Devries. Dieudonné's military assessment suggested that eliminating Renard first would be the prudent choice.
Significantly improve their chances of successfully reaching Devries, though such preliminary action would also increase the overall complexity and risk of the operation. On his 4th evening at the plantation, Dieudonné had a brief conversation with Mama Nzinga, an elderly woman who worked in the main house kitchens and had served in that capacity for nearly 20 years.
Nzinga was cautious in her responses to Duodane's seemingly casual questions about household routines, but something in his manner apparently convinced her that his interest went beyond idle curiosity. She mentioned in carefully neutral terms that the young woman who had recently fled had occupied a room on the upper floor, that her absence had made Devries increasingly volatile and unpredictable, that the entire household lived in heightened fear of his rages. Nzinga also provided information that would prove crucial to later planning. She described how Devries kept the keys to various locked areas of the house on a ring that he carried during the day but left on his study desk during evening hours when he was working with papers and correspondence. The keys represented both practical tools for accessing restricted spaces and symbolic instruments of his absolute control over the plantation and everyone within it. Their location and accessibility would become important factors in whatever action Amara and her allies ultimately attempted. Duodane departed the plantation on the morning of his 5th day, claiming to another prospective employer that conditions at the Devries operation did not meet his standards and he would seek opportunities elsewhere. He retraced his route to the river landing and secured passage back to Stanleyville on a northbound vessel, carrying in his memory detailed observations that would inform the conspiracy's tactical planning. The return journey allowed him time to mentally organize his intelligence and consider various approaches to the central problem of reaching Devries when he was most vulnerable while minimizing risks to the attackers. He arrived back in Stanleyville on April 26th, making his way to Beaumont's clinic after dark when his appearance would attract minimal attention. Amara, Andre, and Beaumont gathered in the storage room that had become their planning space, listening as Duodane presented his findings with the clinical precision of someone trained to deliver intelligence briefings. He had drawn rough maps from memory, sketching the plantation layout, marking key buildings, noting distances and sightlines that would matter during any nighttime operation. The central strategic question was whether to attempt eliminating Renard as a preliminary action or to accept the risk of his potential interference and focus exclusively on reaching Devries. Duodane argued for the former approach, pointing out that Renard's capacity for violence and his unpredictable nighttime movements made him too dangerous to ignore. Andre agreed from his experience with force publique operations, noting that leaving a capable opponent unconsidered was an elementary tactical error that invited catastrophic failure. But Amara raised a different concern. The operation's purpose was not military victory, but personal justice, her reclamation of agency through direct confrontation with the man who had stolen her humanity. Adding Renard as a target transformed the action from focused revenge into something broader and less personally meaningful. The debate continued through most of that night, weighing risks against objectives, discussing contingencies and fallback options, gradually refining their understanding of what they were actually attempting to accomplish. They finally reached consensus on a modified approach. They would travel to the plantation as a group, position themselves to observe Renard's location on the chosen night, and eliminate him only if circumstances made it necessary for reaching Devries safely. This preserved Amara's central role in confronting her tormentor while acknowledging tactical realities that could not be ignored without courting disaster.